Hey everyone, today we're going to be making the Italian-American classic spaghetti and meatballs. And not only that, we're going to go over some of the history of how it became popularized here in the States. So let's not waste any time and let's get to it. Okay, to get started, we're going to place 1.5 ounces of diced onions along with 1 tablespoon of olive oil and a small pinch of salt over medium heat. The onions should be cut into 1/4 inch or smaller pieces because larger pieces will make it challenging to form meatballs. Once the onions have become slightly softened, add 1/2 ounce of minced garlic to the pan, and after that cooks for a minute, we can set that aside and turn our attention to the sauce. And for that, place a small pot over medium heat, and once that heats up, add roughly 2 tablespoons of olive oil along with 6 ounces of onions to the pot. Give it a stir, add a pinch of salt, and continue to cook and soften the onions until they've taken on a small bit of color around the edges. That should take roughly 4 to 5 minutes, and once you've reached that point, go ahead and add 1/2 ounce of minced garlic along with 1 teaspoon of chili flakes, and continue to stir the pot and be careful not to burn the garlic. The garlic only needs to cook for about a minute, and then we can add a bit of tomato paste. I would prefer 2 tablespoons here. I'm probably a bit short, but it still should be fine. That's the beauty of a lot of recipes like this. They don't really have to be exact, and you'll likely end up with the same result. As a side note, I prefer tomato paste in a tube because it's easier to store afterwards. Continue to cook this mixture until a rust-colored fond develops at the bottom of the pan. Then add 1 28-ounce can of pureed tomatoes along with 1 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes, 1.5 teaspoons each of salt and dried oregano, and 3/4 teaspoon of basil to the pan. Once everything has been added, bring the mixture to a simmer and keep it at a low simmer for about 30 minutes. And while that cooks, let's turn our attention back to our meatballs. To make these, let's start by breaking 1 egg into a mixing bowl and whisking it together. Once you're finished with that, go ahead and add 1.5 cups of breadcrumbs, 1.5 teaspoons each salt and dried oregano, 3/4 teaspoons dried basil, and the onion and garlic mixture from earlier. Give everything a mix together and make sure everything is thoroughly combined, then we can go ahead and add 1.5 pounds of ground beef to the mixture. I prefer doing it this way because once you add the meat, it can be overmixed and become tough. And another side note on meatballs and meatloaf, 1 teaspoon of salt per pound of meat is a good ratio to work with. Once you've added the meat, briefly mix it together, and this needs to sit for about 15 minutes to allow the binding agents to do their work and make the meatballs more cohesive. And while that's happening, let's learn some history. So spaghetti and meatballs both exist in Italy, but rarely are they paired together, and usually when they are, it's to appease Western tourists. Meatballs in Italy exist in many different forms. They can be made from beef, pork, lamb, turkey, or even fish. Traditionally, they contain equal portions of meat and soaked bread and are much less dense than the ones we know here. They are generally about the size of a golf ball, and the Italian word for meatball is polpette. And polpettine is a slightly smaller meatball from the Abruzzo region. These meatballs are often eaten without a sauce or as part of a soup. So you're wondering, how exactly did spaghetti and meatballs catch on here in the States? Well, during the late 1800s and early 1900s, about 4 million Italians immigrated to America, and about 80% of those were Southern Italians. They settled into Lower Manhattan, and a small area around Mulberry Street became known as Little Italy. Many were too impoverished to travel beyond this, but one thing that was more affordable here in the States was meat, and subsequently meatballs. The red sauce we call marinara sauce comes from the Italian word marinaro, meaning sailor, just as mariner does in our language. This was a convenient sauce because it could be made quickly, and many of the ingredients, such as canned tomatoes, were readily available. Pasta and spaghetti noodles were also widely available, and because Americans were accustomed to having both a starch and protein as part of a complete meal, spaghetti and meatballs was born. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about that today, and let's get back to it. Okay, let's get our meatballs portioned out. I'm weighing them at 1.5 ounces each because I think that's a good size. Unlike other people, I don't think they need to be the size of boulders. Once you've got them shaped out, place them into a 400-degree oven. They should take about 20 to 25 minutes in there. And at this point, the sauce has been simmering for about 20 minutes. Go ahead and move it to one of the back burners and place a larger pot with some water over high heat. Add a few pinches of salt, and once that reaches a boil, go ahead and add your spaghetti noodles and try and awkwardly force them into the pot like I did here. Cook them according to the instructions on the package, which should take about 10 to 12 minutes, and by then your meatballs should be done. We can go ahead and add them directly into the pot, and when trying to squeeze them all in, you might encounter something known as Three Stooges syndrome, but don't worry, they all should nestle in nicely eventually.
Move it, shout ahead.
We call it Three Stooges syndrome.
Okay, now that our sauce is fully prepared, once the pasta is all finished up, we can plate this whole thing up. Start by placing a portion of pasta at the center of the plate, followed up with a few meatballs, spoon a bit of sauce over the top, and finally garnish with a few fresh basil leaves and a little bit of shredded Parmesan cheese, and you're set. Spaghetti and meatballs doesn't have to be a complicated all-day project. It should be something simple that anyone can make, and I think anyone can make this. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.